Two sisters vanished during a violent storm in 1984, leaving behind nothing but questions and heartbroken parents who never stopped searching. The case went cold, and decades passed without a single clue about what happened that terrible night. But 36 years later, someone discovers their bikes chained together in an abandoned barn, and what this finding reveals about their final moments makes everyone's blood run cold. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment which part of the world you're watching from, because now I'm going to tell you how all of this happened. October in Millfield, Connecticut had always been Margaret Winter's favorite month. The maple trees along Elm Street transformed into a canopy of crimson and gold, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke and apples. This particular Wednesday morning, however, brought an unseasonable heaviness to the atmosphere that made her glance repeatedly at the kitchen window while preparing breakfast. "They're saying we might get a big storm tonight," Margaret said, setting a plate of scrambled eggs in front of her younger daughter. "I want you girls to come straight home after school today." Sarah, 13, barely looked up from the mathematics textbook propped against the orange juice pitcher. "Mom, I got every equation right on the practice test," she said, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear, her red sweater, hand-knitted by her grandmother last Christmas, slightly too large for her slender frame. 15-year-old Emily slid into her chair, fingers working to attach a new patch to her faded denim jacket. "The Smiths," she mumbled around a piece of toast, referring to the band emblem she was sewing. "Karen let me borrow their new album. It's actually pretty good." The kitchen door swung open as Robert Winters rushed in, briefcase in hand. "Big meeting at Prudential today," he explained, dropping quick kisses on his daughters' heads and a distracted peck on Margaret's cheek. "Might be late tonight." Margaret watched him leave, a familiar worry line appearing between her brows. It had been happening more frequently lately, his absence at family dinners, the late nights at the office, the growing distance between them. "Bus in 10 minutes, girls," she called, turning back to the sink. The morning at Millfield High School unfolded with the predictable rhythm of small-town teenage life. Emily met her friends by the lockers, their conversation centered on Cindy Williams' upcoming Halloween party. "My mom found this amazing vintage dress at the thrift store," Emily told them, adjusting her jacket. "I'm thinking of going as a ghost bride or something." 2 hallways over, Sarah beamed as her algebra teacher handed back yesterday's quiz, a red A+ prominently displayed at the top. The school day ended at 3:15, gray clouds already gathering on the horizon. Emily waited by the bike rack, scanning the crowd for her sister. She checked her watch at 3:40, growing concerned, when Sarah finally appeared, emerging from the direction of the library with 2 large astronomy books clutched to her chest. "Mom said to go straight home," Emily reminded her. Sarah's eyes widened innocently. "I need to return these to the public library. It'll be super quick, promise." Emily sighed but nodded, and they mounted their bicycles, pedaling toward Main Street. The town library was nearly empty when they arrived, the impending storm keeping most patrons at home. Mrs. Wilson, the librarian who had known the girls since they were toddlers, frowned at the darkening sky visible through the large windows. "You girls better hurry on home," she cautioned, as she stamped the return date in Sarah's books. "That sky doesn't look good at all." "We will," Emily promised, checking her watch. 4:15. They'd be cutting it close. The sisters pedaled down Main Street, past the small shops already preparing to close early because of the weather. The security camera outside Miller's convenience store caught them briefly. 2 slender figures on bicycles, one in a patch-covered denim jacket, the other in a red sweater, before they turned onto Chestnut Lane, the tree-lined shortcut that would take them home. It was 5:30 when Margaret first checked the clock, a knot forming in her stomach. The girls were never this late. By 5:45, she had called Emily's 3 closest friends. By 6, she had called the library. "They left nearly 2 hours ago," Mrs. Wilson confirmed, her own voice now tinged with concern. Thunder shook the windows as Robert pulled into the driveway at 6:15, finding Margaret pacing the kitchen, phone clutched in white-knuckled hands. "They never came home," she said, voice breaking. "The storm." Robert was back in his car within minutes, driving slowly along the route between the library and home, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the torrential rain. He rolled down his window despite the downpour, calling his daughter's names into the storm. On Chestnut Lane, Peterson Creek had overflowed its banks, water rushing across sections of the road. At 7:05, Robert called the Millfield Police Department. Sergeant Donovan, a family friend for years, arrived 20 minutes later, rain dripping from his uniform hat as he stepped into the Winters' living room. "Girls might have found shelter somewhere," he suggested, though his eyes betrayed his concern as another crack of thunder shook the house. By 8:30, 3 patrol cars were searching the town. Neighbors joined despite the storm, flashlights cutting through the darkness. At 9:15, the power went out across Millfield, plunging the search into near-total darkness. Dawn brought clear skies and a town damaged by the storm, but no sign of Emily and Sarah Winters or their bicycles. Search parties formed, methodically checking the swollen Peterson Creek and surrounding areas. A county helicopter circled overhead. "They could have been swept away by the current," suggested one officer quietly to Sergeant Donovan, out of the parents' earshot. "Maybe they found shelter and are still waiting for help," offered another. A third theory emerged in whispers. What if someone picked them up on the road? 7 days passed. Margaret hadn't eaten or slept properly for any of them. Robert wandered the town like a ghost, unshaven, red-eyed. On that 7th evening, as darkness fell over Millfield once again, the Winters' phone rang at 11:47. Margaret lunged for it, her voice breaking as she answered. For several long seconds, there was only silence on the line, and then a soft, unmistakable breathing pattern that froze Margaret's heart. She would swear she recognized Sarah's distinctive breath, with its slight asthmatic wheeze. Margaret clutched the phone with trembling hands, her heart racing at the sound of that familiar breathing pattern. "Sarah? Sarah, is that you?" she cried out, desperation breaking her voice. Robert lunged for the other line, frantically dialing Sergeant Donovan's number. Within 30 minutes, Donovan arrived with a communications technician who immediately began tracing the call. The Winters huddled around the equipment, watching anxiously as the technician worked, the only sound in the room their collective breathing. "Got it," the technician finally announced, pointing to the screen. "Public phone at Hartford Bus Terminal." Robert grabbed his car keys. "I'm going there now." "Wait," Donovan said, placing a firm hand on Robert's shoulder. "We've already dispatched Hartford PD to the location. They'll review security footage and call us immediately with any findings." The next morning, Detective Frank Reese sat with the Winters in the Millfield police station, reviewing grainy security footage from the bus terminal. The tape showed only an indistinct figure at the phone booth, face obscured by a hood or hat. "Could be anyone," Reese admitted. "Male or female, impossible to tell. We're enhancing the footage, but don't get your hopes up." A week later, Margaret spread a detailed map of Connecticut across their kitchen table, methodically marking red X's over areas already searched. The map was becoming increasingly crowded with marks, each X representing another dead end, another shattered hope. In the living room, Robert slept fitfully on the couch, still fully dressed, an empty whiskey bottle on the coffee table surrounded by photographs of the girls. He hadn't shaved in days, his work briefcase untouched since the disappearance. The local copy shop owner refused payment when Margaret came to print hundreds more flyers. "Please," he said, pushing back her money. "My daughter is in Emily's science class. These are on me." At the library, Mrs. Wilson paused while reorganizing the young adult section, her fingers trembling as she found a checkout card with Sarah's neat signature. She sat down heavily on a nearby stool, pressing the card to her chest, before carefully placing it in an envelope for Margaret. Christmas arrived, bringing snow and a suffocating silence to the Winters' home. A small tree stood in the corner. Beneath it, 2 carefully wrapped presents for each girl, a leather-bound journal and silver bracelet for Emily, a telescope and advanced calculus textbook for Sarah. The gifts remained untouched until February, when Margaret finally placed them in the attic, unable to bear their presence any longer. During winter break, Millfield High School teachers quietly emptied Emily and Sarah's lockers, placing their belongings in cardboard boxes for the family. Emily's locker yielded forgotten homework assignments, mixtapes, and a half-used roll of film still in her backup camera. Sarah's contained neatly organized notebooks, filled with complex equations that had impressed even her senior-level math teacher. Detective Reese's office walls were covered with photos, timelines, and maps, an entire section dedicated to the Winters case. 3 months into the investigation, during a department meeting, the phrase 126 leads verified, none substantive, was written on the whiteboard as officers discussed reallocating resources to more active cases. Hope flared briefly when a truck driver called the hotline, claiming to have seen 2 girls matching Emily and Sarah's descriptions at a rest stop near the New York border. Margaret and Robert rushed to Brewster, only to review security footage showing 2 similar but clearly different teenagers. 4 months after the disappearance, Robert stared at his computer screen at Prudential Insurance, reading an email about a potential promotion. His fingers absently traced the picture frame on his desk, the smiling faces of his daughters looking back at him from behind glass. That evening, the tension that had been building between Margaret and Robert finally erupted. "How can you think about a promotion now?" Margaret shouted, slamming dishes into the sink. "Someone has to pay for the private investigators," Robert shot back. "The police are giving up, but I'm not." A glass shattered against the wall, neither of them sure who had thrown it. Later that night, Margaret found Robert in the girls' bedroom, silently crying while holding a small pink diary he'd discovered under Emily's mattress. As Margaret sat beside him, he opened the diary to a page neither had seen before, a detailed record of strange encounters with a man Emily had noticed following her and Sarah on their way from school in the weeks before their disappearance. Emily's pink diary transformed the investigation. Detective Reese handled it with gloved hands, carefully turning pages as Margaret and Robert watched. "The man in the green jacket was at the library again today," Emily had written. "He drives a blue Civic. I didn't tell Sarah because I don't want to scare her." "This is significant," Reese said, placing the diary in an evidence bag. "The details about the vehicle give us something concrete to pursue." Within hours, the police station hummed with renewed activity. Officers combed through vehicle registration records, printing out lists of blue Honda Civics within a 50-mile radius. By afternoon, they had narrowed it to 7 potential matches. "One of them belongs to a Joseph Henderson," Reese told Margaret the next day as they drove down a rural road. "He owns property about 3 miles from Chestnut Lane, works at the Amtrak depot in New Haven. He was on shift the day the girls disappeared, but we need to check everything." Margaret remained in the car as they approached Henderson's property, a weathered house with a red barn in the distance. From her window, she watched Joseph Henderson, thin, gray-haired, around 60, greet the officers with visible nervousness. Inside Henderson's sparsely furnished living room, Reese noted the old photographs on the walls, landscapes mostly, curiously devoid of people. Henderson answered questions defensively, claiming he knew nothing about the missing girls and offering to let officers look around his property. The search was cursory. Officers walked the grounds but didn't enter the barn when Henderson explained the rusty lock had no key. From the car, Margaret watched their brief inspection with growing frustration. That evening at the library, Robert conducted his own research, discovering in old newspaper archives that Henderson had been briefly investigated following his wife's death in 1978, ruled accidental despite suspicious circumstances. "Why didn't they dig deeper?" Robert demanded when Reese called to report they'd found nothing conclusive at the Henderson property. The next day, Reese visited the Hartford probation office, reviewing records that revealed Nathan Henderson, Joseph's 27-year-old nephew, had been released from prison 3 months before the girl's disappearance. His last known address was in New Haven. "Nathan served 18 months for aggravated assault," Reese explained to the Winters. "His probation officer hasn't seen him since October last year. They assumed he left the state." As the first anniversary of the disappearance approached, Millfield prepared for a memorial vigil. The high school became a hub of activity, with students tying blue and green ribbons, the girls' favorite colors, around trees and lampposts throughout town. Margaret discovered Robert's transfer letter from Prudential to Hartford while searching for batteries in their bedroom dresser. The start date, November 1st, was just 2 weeks away. He hadn't mentioned it once. That evening, hundreds gathered in the Central Park, candlelight illuminating faces both familiar and strange. Margaret scanned the crowd repeatedly, but Robert was nowhere to be seen. When her turn came to speak, Margaret approached the podium shakily. "Thank you all for keeping my girls in your hearts," she began. "A year feels like forever when you don't know." Her voice failed her, and she couldn't continue. Later that night, Margaret received a frantic call from Sergeant Donovan. She rushed to the Millfield police station, finding Robert in a holding cell, his face bruised and expression vacant. "He broke into Henderson's property," Donovan explained quietly, "nearly beat Joseph to death. He was screaming about the barn, about lies. Henderson's in the hospital, says he's pressing charges." After posting bail, Margaret drove home alone, her mind reeling from the evening's events. The car radio crackled with static before a news bulletin cut through. "Breaking news from Millfield County. A large fire has been reported at the rural property of Joseph Henderson. Early reports indicate the red barn at the back of the property was the first structure to catch fire." Margaret's tires screeched as she pulled onto the rural road leading to Henderson's property. The orange glow in the night sky grew brighter as she approached, and soon the full horror came into view. The red barn engulfed in roaring flames, firefighters battling helplessly against the inferno. Police cruisers lined the access road, their lights casting eerie blue and red patterns across the chaos. "You can't go any closer, ma'am," an officer warned, blocking her path. "It's not safe." "Where's Joseph Henderson?" Margaret demanded, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. The officer shook his head. "Nowhere to be found. Neighbor says he saw him driving away about an hour before the fire started." By morning, the barn was reduced to smoldering ruins. Smoke still rose from blackened timbers as fire investigators sifted carefully through the debris. Despite Robert's ironclad alibi, he'd been in police custody when the fire began. Detective Reese still questioned him extensively. "I know how this looks," Robert insisted, wincing as he touched the bruises from his confrontation with Henderson. "But I was in your cell when the fire started, for God's sake." Later that afternoon, a fire investigator in a heat-resistant suit collected samples in small glass vials from various points in the charred remains. "Accelerant," he confirmed to Reese. "This was definitely arson." The following day, excavators arrived to clear the debris. The operator had barely begun when he stopped suddenly, calling over the investigators. "There's some kind of structure underneath," he shouted. "It's not on any of the building plans." Word traveled quickly. By noon, Agent Claire Lawson from the State Investigation Department had arrived, her short gray hair and no-nonsense demeanor commanding immediate respect as she flashed her credentials at the local officers. "I specialize in long-term missing persons cases," she explained to Reese. "Hartford sent me when they heard about the underground structure. Forensic technicians carefully photographed twisted metal fragments recovered from the ruins." "These could be bicycle parts," Lawson observed, examining the melted remnants. "The fire damage makes it difficult to be certain, but the dimensions are consistent." Across town, Brian Hennessy, a 35-year-old investigative journalist from the Hartford Courant, sat in the living room of Henderson's former neighbor. "Nathan always gave me the creeps," the elderly woman confided. "Used to watch the kids at the bus stop for hours. Joseph would make excuses, say the boy was adjusting after prison." In her Hartford office, Agent Lawson built a new investigation board, meticulously arranging photos of Emily and Sarah, newspaper clippings, and a map of the Henderson property. A question mark occupied the space labeled Nathan Henderson. The excavation continued for days. Forensic teams methodically sifted through soil around the barn site, using metal detectors and fine mesh screens to catch even the smallest evidence. At the Elm Street house, Margaret stood surrounded by boxes of Robert's belongings. Their separation felt both inevitable and wrong. Her hand hovered over the telephone, unsure if she should call him with updates. At the State Forensic Laboratory, a technician showed Lawson preliminary results from soil samples collected beneath the barn. These chemical markers are consistent with long-term human habitation, he explained. And these trace elements suggest the presence of restraints, possibly chains. Agent Lawson tracked down Nathan's probation officer, a tired man with too many cases. Henderson just stopped checking in around November '84, he confirmed. We assumed he'd skipped state, issued a warrant, but nobody really looked for him. In a quiet cafe downtown, Brian Hennessy spread his research before Margaret. Joseph Henderson had a history of suspicious behavior around children in New Haven during the '70s, he explained. Multiple complaints, but charges were never filed. The cases were buried. As investigators prepared to conclude their search of the Henderson property, declaring it inconclusive due to fire damage, a forensic lab technician called Agent Lawson with alarming news. Despite the intense heat of the fire, they had extracted DNA from tissue found wedged in a crack in the basement concrete, and the profile matched Sarah Winters. The DNA match to Sarah Winters changed everything. In the sterile laboratory, the technician explained to Agent Lawson how they'd extracted viable genetic material from a nearly destroyed sample. It's a 99.9% match to the reference sample from Sarah's hairbrush, he confirmed, pointing to the results on his monitor. Within 24 hours, Agent Lawson assembled an expanded investigative team in the state police headquarters. Photos of Joseph and Nathan Henderson dominated the briefing room whiteboard, with timelines and evidence logs meticulously arranged around them. We now have physical evidence placing Sarah Winters at the Henderson property, Lawson announced. Our priorities are locating Joseph Henderson and reconstructing Nathan Henderson's movements in '84. Consider both men armed and dangerous. Margaret's legs nearly gave out when Lawson called with the DNA confirmation. She braced herself against the wall, whispering, "So they really were there." Brian Hennessy spent days in New Haven's courthouse archives, unearthing troubling court transcripts. Nathan Henderson was charged with stalking and attempted abduction of a 14-year-old girl in 1982, he told Margaret over coffee. The charges were mysteriously dropped when the victim's family suddenly moved away. In his Hartford apartment, Robert watched the nightly news with bloodshot eyes, empty bottles surrounding him. The anchor's voice droned on about new developments in the Winters sisters' disappearance, while Robert mumbled responses to the television as if it could hear him. Financial investigators discovered suspicious patterns in Joseph Henderson's bank records, an $8,000 cash withdrawal on October 22, 1984, 5 days after the girls disappeared, and another $12,000 withdrawal right before the barn fire in 1985. At a maximum security prison in northern Connecticut, Agent Lawson sat across from Mike Doyle, Nathan's former cellmate. He wouldn't shut up about this special place he built in his uncle's barn, Doyle recalled. Said he could keep someone there for years without nobody knowing. Used to draw these detailed floor plans when he thought I wasn't looking. On a crisp autumn morning, Margaret stood alone at the empty Henderson property, now just an overgrown lot surrounded by faded police tape. She placed a small bouquet where the barn had stood, whispering words only she could hear. By 1989, 5 years had passed since the disappearance. The annual vigils had dwindled to a handful of attendees, mostly family friends and a few dedicated teachers who remembered the girls. Margaret's kitchen calendar displayed October 17th circled in red, marking another anniversary. The photograph beside it showed Emily and Sarah's school portraits, their young faces frozen in time while Margaret had grown older, lines of grief etching themselves permanently around her eyes. In a Hartford television studio, Margaret sat uncomfortably under bright lights as the host asked the same questions she'd answered countless times before. "After 5 years, do you still have hope?" he asked, while technicians displayed age-progressed images of what Emily and Sarah might look like now. The letter arrived unexpectedly, cream-colored stationery, with an embossed return address, Marjorie Simmons, psychic consultant, Boston. "I've had visions of your daughters," it read. They are alive, in a place with snowy mountains and a red flag. Water nearby, they are together. At the Lakeside Rehabilitation Center, Robert clutched a coffee cup with trembling hands during group therapy. "I should have been home that night," he confessed, voice breaking. "Not working late, not trying to make partner while my family fell apart." Margaret spent 3 weeks in Toronto, driving through small Canadian towns with her map covered in circles, possible locations based on the psychic's vague description. Each town brought fresh disappointment. Each inquiry met with sympathetic but empty responses. Agent Lawson, now showing strands of silver at her temples, briefed a new team of investigators. Joseph Henderson likely fled the country, possibly to South America. "We've had potential sightings in Brazil and Argentina, but nothing confirmed." Upon returning to Millfield, after her fruitless Canadian search, Margaret found a manila envelope in her mailbox containing divorce papers from Robert's lawyer. She sat on the porch steps, holding the envelope, as autumn leaves swirled around her feet. The night before signing the divorce papers, Margaret's phone rang at 11:37. When she answered, a digitally distorted voice delivered 8 chilling words. "Joseph is buried, where the girls were kept first." The mysterious caller's words echoed in Margaret's mind as she immediately dialed Agent Lawson's number. "Joseph is buried where the girls were kept first," she repeated, her voice trembling with urgency. Despite the late hour, Lawson arrived at Margaret's house within 30 minutes. "Play it again," Lawson instructed, setting up a small recording device on the kitchen table. The distorted voice sent chills through both women as they listened. The following morning, Lawson, now gray-haired and contemplating retirement, pulled dusty evidence boxes from the state police archives. "There has to be something we missed," she muttered, flipping through financial records until she found it, a property deed from 1962 for a hunting cabin in the Berkshire Mountains. The Hendersons owned a second property, Margaret realized, examining the topographical maps Lawson spread across the conference table later that day. That could be where they initially kept the girls. "The deed mentions it's near a creek, but these records are ancient," Lawson explained, marking coordinates on a modern map. "The terrain has changed, trails have disappeared. This won't be easy." 3 days later, a search team with cadaver dogs trudged through the difficult mountainous terrain. Years of forest growth had reclaimed old pathways, making navigation challenging even with GPS equipment. On the second day of searching, a K9 officer's radio crackled to life. "We found something. Coordinates 43.782, negative 73.164. The wooden cabin appeared as if from a nightmare, partially collapsed, consumed by vegetation, with a small tool shed behind it, almost invisible among the trees. Years of harsh New England winters had taken their toll on the structure, yet it remained standing like a monument to buried secrets. Forensic technicians carefully removed rotting floorboards from the shed, revealing disturbed soil beneath. The excavation proceeded methodically, each layer of dirt removed with precision, until one technician's brush revealed the unmistakable curve of a human skull. "Single gunshot wound to the back of the head," the forensic pathologist noted, pointing to the entry hole in the recovered cranium. "Small caliber, likely a .22. Inside the cabin, agents photographed and cataloged every item, including a box containing teenage girls' clothing, jeans, t-shirts, and a deteriorated red sweater that made Margaret gasp when shown photographs. "That's Sarah's," she whispered, recognizing the distinctive pattern despite years of decay. The most disturbing discovery came wrapped in plastic beneath a loose floorboard, a partially burned photo album, its pages fused together by years of dampness. In the lab, technicians carefully separated the pages, revealing Polaroid photographs that confirmed everyone's worst fears. "We can only see partial images," the lab technician explained to Lawson, displaying the recovered photos. "Faces aren't visible, but the hair color matches Emily's in this one." At 59, Robert Winters looked remarkably better than he had in years. Sobriety had restored some of his former self, though his eyes still carried the haunted look of a man who had lost everything that mattered. Nathan likely turned on his uncle, the FBI criminologist suggested during his interview with Robert. Our theory is that he killed Joseph approximately 6 months after the girls disappeared, possibly to eliminate a witness or due to a disagreement about what to do with the girls. That evening, Margaret sat alone in her bedroom, opening a storage box she'd kept untouched for years. Inside lay Emily's spare denim jacket, still bearing the faint scent of the perfume her daughter had loved. The following afternoon, Robert and Margaret sat together on the porch of the Elm Street house, talking openly for the first time in years. "Remember how Sarah used to sing in the shower?" Robert asked, a sad smile crossing his face. "Always Disney songs, always off-key. And Emily would bang on the bathroom door, complaining about the hot water," Margaret added, tears gathering in her eyes. The 10-year anniversary special aired on Connecticut Public Television, bringing renewed attention to the case. "One of New England's most disturbing unsolved mysteries," the host intoned over school photographs of Emily and Sarah. Later that night, Agent Lawson's phone rang. A retired Canadian border guard named Stephen Porter had seen the broadcast and remembered something significant from February 1985, a nervous man with 2 teenage girls who matched Emily and Sarah's descriptions crossing into Ontario. The girls had seemed disoriented, he recalled, but he'd assumed they were just tired from traveling. The investigation into the Canadian border crossing revealed a shocking detail. Immigration records showed that 2 weeks after the date mentioned by the guard, Toronto General Hospital admitted 2 unidentified teenage girls found wandering confused on a rural road, both suffering from severe hypothermia and a rare type of traumatic amnesia. The hospital records revelation sent a jolt of electricity through the investigation. Lawson immediately booked 2 tickets to Toronto, and within hours, she and Margaret were rushing through the airport terminal. "Toronto General Hospital, as fast as possible," Lawson instructed the taxi driver, flashing her badge for emphasis. "It's an emergency." At the hospital's administration office, they hit their first obstacle. A bureaucratic administrator in wire-rimmed glasses shook his head apologetically. "Records over 30 years old are stored off-site. We need special authorizations, which could take days, possibly weeks." Margaret leaned across the desk, her eyes brimming with tears. "Please, these might be my daughters. I've waited 36 years for this moment." Her raw emotion penetrated the administrator's professional detachment. 3 hours later, they sat in a dusty archives room, carefully turning pages of yellowed files. "Look at this," Lawson whispered, sliding a black-and-white photograph across the table. Margaret's hands trembled as she held the hospital intake photo, showing 2 emaciated teenagers with frightened eyes, unmistakably Emily and Sarah despite their traumatized state. The medical report attached stated, "Patients present with severe dissociative traumatic amnesia, possibly triggered by catastrophic psychological event." Dr. Aaron Chen, now 67 with silver-streaked hair, still worked at the hospital. He remembered the case immediately when contacted. "I never forgot those girls," he said, examining the old charts in his office. "So terrified, yet so protective of each other. The younger one would only speak if the older one was in the room." He explained how the amnesia manifested. Jenny, Sarah, would wake up screaming about the man in the jacket, but couldn't elaborate further. Alice, Emily, refused to enter windowless rooms and became hysterical if separated from her sister. In the hospital conference room, Chen played preserved audio recordings from therapy sessions. Emily's voice, younger but recognizable, described fragmentary memories. "It was so cold. We kept walking. There was so much snow. I thought we would die." While Lawson worked the phones with Canadian authorities to trace the girl's path through the social services system, Margaret sat alone in her hotel room, arranging old family photos alongside the hospital pictures. The similarities were undeniable. Same eyes, same facial structure, even the same way Emily tilted her head slightly when uncertain. Robert arrived late that evening, exhausted from the hasty flight. When Margaret opened the door, they embraced spontaneously, their first genuine hug in years. "They're alive, Maggie," Robert whispered, his voice breaking. "Our girls are alive." The next morning at the social services office, a sympathetic administrator located the adoption records from 1985. The file contained a photograph of the Bennett family, two kind-faced university professors with their arms around the teenage girls who would become Alice and Jenny Bennett. Back at the hotel, Lawson pulled up a professional website on her laptop. "Alice Bennett Photography, Vancouver," she announced, turning the screen toward Margaret. The site showcased stunning nature photography and intimate portraits, the artistic sensibility unmistakably similar to Emily's teenage Polaroid compositions. "And here," Lawson said, opening another tab. "Department of Mathematics, McGill University, Dr. Jennifer Bennett, Associate Professor of Applied Mathematics." The faculty photo showed a serious-looking woman with glasses, her bio noting her specialization in complex systems, precisely the mathematical concepts that had fascinated 13-year-old Sarah. That evening, Margaret, Robert, and Lawson sat planning their approach. "We need to be extremely careful," Lawson cautioned. "A shock like this could be psychologically devastating for them. Their entire sense of identity is built on their lives as the Bennett sisters." As they debated the gentlest way to make contact, the hotel room phone rang. Margaret answered, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "That was the American consulate," she said, hanging up. "A reporter from the Toronto Star has discovered our investigation and plans to publish a front-page story tomorrow morning titled, 'Missing Connecticut Sisters Found Living in Canada,' threatening to expose Alice and Jenny to the truth in the worst possible way." "I need 24 hours, Lawson demanded, phone pressed to her ear as she paced the hotel room. "You publish this now, and you risk psychological harm to two innocent women." The Toronto Star editor eventually relented, agreeing to delay publication in exchange for exclusive follow-up access. Dawn found the American and Canadian officials gathered in the consulate's conference room, hastily arranging a crisis intervention. The legal advisor shook his head, reviewing the unprecedented situation. "There's no clear legal precedent for this scenario." Dr. Mercer, a trauma specialist flown in overnight from Boston, counseled Margaret and Robert as they prepared for the potential reunion. "Don't expect immediate recognition," he warned. "Their brains have protected them for decades by blocking these memories." In Vancouver, Alice Bennett was arranging photographs for her upcoming exhibition when her phone rang. She listened with growing confusion to the vague yet urgent request for her presence in Toronto. "Something about my origins?" she repeated, jotting down details while signaling to her assistant to reschedule tomorrow's appointments. Meanwhile, in Montreal, Jenny Bennett stepped away from her advanced mathematics lecture when her department secretary urgently summoned her to the hallway. "They wouldn't say exactly what it's about," Jenny told her teaching assistant, frowning as she gathered her materials. "Just that it's regarding my personal history and requires immediate attention." Throughout the night, Margaret and Robert rehearsed what they might say, with Margaret nervously arranging and rearranging items on the bedside table. Old photographs, Emily's spare denim jacket, a small bird pendant that had been her 15th birthday gift. The following morning, Jenny arrived at the consulate first, her scholarly composure betrayed by nervous fingers, adjusting her glasses. "You mentioned this concerns my origins," she stated to Agent Lawson, "but I don't understand the urgency or why the FBI is involved." Lawson carefully began the explanation. "In 1984, two sisters disappeared during a storm in Connecticut," she said, sliding photographs across the table. "In 1985, two young women with amnesia were found near Toronto." Jenny's academic mind analyzed the evidence methodically, examining photos of Emily and Sarah Winters, then the hospital photos of Alice and Jenny, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the unmistakable similarities. 3 hours later, Alice arrived, immediately embracing her sister. "What's happening?" she whispered urgently. "Are you okay?" Dr. Mercer guided the conversation with practiced expertise, gradually introducing evidence, birth dates that aligned perfectly, similar talents in photography and mathematics, even identical birthmarks that the sisters had never questioned. As the reality slowly settled over them, Jenny unconsciously touched the half-moon scar on her left wrist. "I always thought this was from some childhood accident," she murmured. "The Bennetts didn't know how it happened." Margaret, unable to contain herself, spoke softly from across the table. "It was from the oak tree in the backyard. You were 8 years old and wanted to see the baby squirrels in the nest." Jenny's eyes widened, her brilliant mathematical mind suddenly confronted with an equation it couldn't solve. For the first time since entering the room, she truly looked at Margaret, not as a stranger making an outlandish claim, but as someone intimately familiar. Alice protectively held her sister's arm, a gesture identical to how Emily had always shielded Sarah. Robert noticed immediately, tears welling in his eyes as he witnessed this unconscious echo from their childhood. The afternoon stretched into evening, with stories shared and photographs examined. Though still overwhelmed, the sisters began asking tentative questions about their childhood, each answer from Margaret or Robert triggering small flickers of recognition. As the meeting continued, Jenny reached for her bag and withdrew a worn notebook she'd carried for as long as she could remember. When she opened it, everyone fell silent at the sight of obsessively repeated drawings of the same red barn that had featured in the investigations, a building that Jenny Bennett had no conscious way of knowing existed. Jenny's notebook silenced the room. The crude sketches of the red barn, drawn with an almost obsessive repetition over the years, were unmistakably the Henderson property. Dr. Mercer gently took the notebook, comparing the drawings to crime scene photographs. "Your subconscious preserved this memory, even when your conscious mind blocked it," he explained, his voice soft with clinical precision. "This is extraordinarily significant." Alice reached over, touching one of the drawings with trembling fingers. "I always hated when you drew these. They gave me nightmares, but I never understood why." The following morning, both sisters agreed to undergo careful therapeutic sessions with Dr. Mercer. In his temporary office at the consulate, Jenny reclined with closed eyes, her voice barely audible as memories began surfacing. "It's raining so hard, I can't see the road," she whispered, hands gripping the armrests. Alice, is worried about getting home late." During her separate session, tears streamed down Alice's face as fractured recollections emerged. "He said he would take us somewhere safe, Green Jacket." He smiled in a strange way that made my stomach hurt. Through the observation window, Margaret and Robert watched hand in hand, witnessing their daughters relive the trauma that had torn their family apart. Robert's knuckles whitened as Jenny described the captivity. "It gets dark for long periods," she murmured. "Two men. The older one rarely speaks, the younger one watches us, says we're his special girls now." Dr. Mercer emerged from the sessions looking grim. "They're recalling genuine fragments, but substantial gaps may never be recovered. The amnesia served as protection from unbearable trauma." Over the next 3 days, more pieces fell into place. Alice recalled their escape during a particularly vivid session. "There was snow everywhere. I grabbed something heavy, metal. He fell. So much blood. I took Jenny, and we ran." That evening in Margaret's hotel suite, Alice cautiously shared her professional portfolio. Margaret's hands shook as she turned pages, seeing compositions that echoed Emily's childhood Polaroids, the same eye for light and shadow, the same tendency to frame subjects slightly off-center. "You were always taking pictures," Margaret said softly. "Your father gave you your first camera for your 10th birthday." Across the room, Robert and Jenny discovered their shared passion for mathematics had bridged the decades of separation. "You always were a prodigy," Robert said, voice thick with emotion. "Your teachers said they'd never seen anything like your abilities." Later that night, Alice called her husband in Vancouver. "David, it's complicated to explain," she began, pacing nervously. "Yes, they're my biological parents. No, I didn't know. There's so much more to tell you." Jenny showed Margaret photos of her daughter on her phone. "Olivia is 22, studying medicine in Toronto," she explained. Margaret's breath caught as she recognized Robert's distinctive eyes in her granddaughter's face. The next morning, Margaret summoned her courage. "Would you like to see the house where you grew up? I still live there on Elm Street." The question hung in the air, weighted with decades of absence and unknown memories. Alice unconsciously touched the small bird pendant she'd always worn, her fingers tracing its familiar contours. "This was mine, wasn't it?" she asked quietly. "From you. I always knew it was important, but I didn't know why." Margaret nodded, unable to speak as she watched her daughter's fingers caress the silver pendant she'd given Emily on her last birthday before the disappearance. That night, as they finalized plans to visit Millfield together, Agent Lawson received an urgent call. Canadian investigators, tracing the sisters' escape route from 1985, had located a retired truck driver who remembered giving two traumatized teenagers a ride. Remarkably, he had kept the backpack one of them had left in his truck all these years, containing a detailed diary that might finally reveal the full truth about what happened during those months they were missing. The diary lay on the conference table, its faded red cover worn at the edges, pages yellowed by time. Emily's teenage handwriting filled the pages with meticulous entries, beginning October 18, 1984, the day after the sisters disappeared. "I recognize this," Emily whispered, her fingers hovering over the diary without touching it, as if it might burn her. "I kept it hidden in my sock." The first entries detailed their initial captivity. Day 3 in the dark place. The younger man, Nathan, brought food today. Said we're his special girls now. I'm so scared but can't let Sarah see. Sarah trembled as Emily read aloud the entry describing their planned transfer. "Nathan says his uncle is getting nervous, that we need to go to a better place in the mountains where no one will find us." Dr. Mercer observed with professional fascination. "This diary is extraordinary. Emily's subconscious created a record, preserving the truth, even when her brain later blocked these memories." The following week, the extended family arrived in Millfield. As they passed the town sign, now weathered by decades, Emily instinctively raised her camera to capture it, tears silently streaming down her face. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she unlocked the door of the Elm Street house. The sisters stood hesitantly on the threshold, their eyes drawn to the familiar staircase, the wallpaper different, but the banister still the same worn oak they had slid down as children. In the backyard, Sarah touched the ancient oak tree, now much larger than in her fragmented memories. "I fell from here," she said softly, trying to see the squirrels. Their visit to Millfield High School brought an emotional reunion with Mrs. Wilson, the former librarian, now 91 years old. She embraced them with trembling arms, tears flowing freely. "My girls, my dear girls, I knew you would come back someday." At the local cemetery, the family gathered around Robert's gravestone. Emily held Margaret's hand as Sarah placed flowers at the base, both mourning the father they had rediscovered too late. The community center hosted a small reception where aging neighbors and former classmates came to witness what many called the miracle of Millfield. Old photographs of the girls were displayed alongside current ones, a visual timeline of lives interrupted and reconstructed. As weeks passed, the families began merging their lives. Emily's husband David arranged an extended leave of absence from his architecture firm in Vancouver. "We can stay a few months, maybe rent something nearby," he told Margaret. "I want the children to know their history." In a small Millfield law office, the sisters signed documents officially changing their names to Emily Alice Bennett and Sarah Jenny Bennett, a symbolic integration of their divided identities. Margaret started a new photo album, its first page displaying the sisters' school pictures from 1984 beside a newly taken photograph at the same spot on Chestnut Lane where they had disappeared, the two women standing precisely where their younger selves had last been seen. On a warm evening in June, 3 generations gathered for dinner on the porch of the Elm Street house. Margaret sat at the head of the table, watching with quiet gratitude as conversations flowed around her, Emily's son discussing photography with his grandmother, Sarah's daughter showing Robert's old chess set to her younger cousins. As twilight settled over Millfield, Emily and Sarah walked together to the corner where Elm Street met Chestnut Lane. The sisters stood silently, watching fireflies begin to rise from the grass where Peterson Creek had once overflowed its banks during that fateful storm. Emily placed her arm around her younger sister's shoulders in a protective gesture, identical to the one she had used when they were children. Sarah smiled and whispered, "We finally kept our promise, Em." Emily nodded, tears in her eyes as she softly completed the thought. "Yes, we came home before dark. It just took us a little longer than expected."